Welcome to the podcast, I should say webinar, from Foxit Software on the topic of Is Your Cloud Content Strategy a Ticking Time Bomb? We are going to get started in just a couple of minutes, so stay tuned. Welcome everyone to Foxit's webinar, Is Your Cloud Content Strategy a Ticking Time Bomb? My name is Kai Willer, Director of Strategic Alliances for the Enterprise Automation Business Unit here at Foxit. Today's topic is focused on 3 or 4 different points. One is just to take a look at the storage market. From there, try to see, is your organization facing that ticking time bomb around cloud storage? Then, of course, how might you go about diffusing that time bomb? And if you were to do so, what vendor should you look for to help you with diffusing that time bomb? Feel free to ask questions at any time using the blog capability or chat capability here in the webinar, and I'll do my best to respond right there in line with the webinar. Let's get right to it. From a storage market data perspective, I found an interesting study from Dell EMC that took a look at the global market from a data protection perspective. They've been tracking that market for some time and saw a pretty fantastic increase in the amount of data that organizations need to track. They talked to over 2,000 IT decision makers globally in a whole bunch of different industries, and a 569% increase in the amount of data that organizations are tracking. So that's some pretty explosive growth that organizations are facing, which ultimately leads to the point of this webinar, is that companies are often underestimating just how much content is being created. And since you pay for content for storage in the cloud, that ultimately is where that time bomb starts ticking. The Enterprise Storage Forum and its 8 tips for beating the big data alludes in the same direction, that the estimate that organizations have for how big the big data might get are often laughable within a year or two. And it's right in line with exactly that problem, that there's just so much more data than what organizations are originally planning for. And that leads us to our final issue, is that once you then look to put your content in the cloud, that's where you start paying by the gigabyte or by the terabyte. And it's not necessarily the terabyte fees themselves, but the additional other fees that can come to bite you down the road. So let's take a look at that. We're finding that it's a bit of a wild west out there when it comes to how storage fees are charged. So there's a big cost variance. So there's your ECM providers that could, of course, this is an apples to oranges comparison here. I'll build this out a little bit. The ECM environment, of course, when you pay that $10 to $30 a gigabyte per month, you're paying for an entire enterprise content management system, not just storage itself. But it is really just meant to give you a feeling for how big the variance can be between purpose-built ECM environments versus sort of vertical applications like CRM applications. And then, of course, your typical cloud storage provider, where you are, in fact, just paying for storage, is therefore an order of magnitude lower in cost. So the initial glimpse at this data might lead you down the road to say, oh, look, this is a no-brainer. I should go with public cloud storage, don't go with these purpose-built SaaS applications. But is that the whole storage? The whole story, I should say. There's often more to it, and of course that's exactly what we want to get into here. So as we look at egress charges, that's one of the things that's often overlooked. And so here's a study by Druva, AWS Cloud Data Protection Survey. They found that in fact 100% of the respondents did not feel that the cost savings for migrating your data to the cloud would ever materialize. And in fact, 49% of them said that cost is the biggest barrier to cloud storage adoption. So just seeing that over and over again, that there's an expectation that going to the cloud is cheaper, but that does not necessarily tend to be the case. And it's egress charges, meaning the costs to access the data once you have it in the cloud, that come to bite you. And it's so unpredictable because A, because of the increase that is unpredictable, and B, the actual usage pattern could be changing over time from within your organization. And so here then comes the question of, do you have that ticking time bomb? And so here's some tips on how you might try to sort of self-diagnose your organization. And of course, the first thing is to take a look at what content and how much of the different content types do you have. So some examples here are, good old image files, those TIFFs and JPEGs and PDFs, especially when they're scanned, tend to take up a lot of space. But of course, audio, video, IoT data can also take up a lot of space. So take a look in your organization and try to figure out, what do you actually have as part of the self-diagnosis? But then as part of it is how much is it increasing? Is it increasing consistently, or is there significant growth over time in the increase itself? Are there seasonal patterns to the increase that you should be aware of? And then, of course, sometimes forecasting the unforecastable, what acquisitions are there coming your way that you may have to ingest into your IT systems, and or what migrations need to be planned as a result of consolidation of systems. From there, you can then start looking at, all right, what are those fees that I'm paying, not just storage, but also those egress charges. And there's then that question of, is what I'm paying for actually aligned with my archiving strategy? Do I need everything to be in the fastest access range, or could I potentially shift content around? And of course, is my access profile changing over time? This requires a lot of interaction with the actual business users to try to make sure that the actual systems and what you're paying for and the patterns align with how users are using the content that's actually being stored. And that ultimately allows you to identify opportunities to reduce egress costs. And it's really important to note that the application of the software is going to be, the pattern and profile will be different for each application. And of course, each storage provider has different types of fees. We threw a few examples here on the right side of the slide. So now, how do you go about diffusing the time bomb? And this is a bit of like a garage clean out, right? So you take a look at, do I need it? Could you get rid of some content? And then, well, if I do need it, how long do I need it? And where do I put it? And then finally, the information that I am keeping, is there a way to optimize it to control the cost? So let's break that down. Do I need it? This is the easy one, but maybe also a really hard one, right? So you could, of course, make decisions about what you keep and what you don't keep, but it's really critical to partner with the business around this, because if you don't, you're potentially setting yourself up for rogue users that will then hang on to content by any means possible if sort of the IT policy doesn't align with what they feel they need. That's how you get content anywhere and everywhere, but not where you need it to be in order to have it under control. So from there, you could then go down the road of the things that the content that you do need to keep. All right, where do you keep it and how long do you keep it? The how long portion, is typically managed via retention policies. And so here we're finding that a lot of organizations are using retention policies in highly regulated parts of their business. But there's often a lot of parts of the organization that don't use retention policies. Sometimes some of the applications don't even have an easy way to implement a retention policy. So there is really a question of taking a look at partnering with the regulatory compliance officers to make sure that you fully understand all the rules and regulations, but continue to partner with the business users so that you're clear on what content actually needs to be kept around. We had a great example of a company that had a retention policy set to this in the insurance space where the retention regulatory requirements were for 5 years. So retention policies were set for 5 years. But it turns out that the policy holder could renew at the end of the 5-year policy, and there was an 18-month clock on that, which means you really needed to hold the content for 7 years so that you didn't erase it after 5 years and then have somebody come in and renew a policy for which you've already erased the content. So obviously, based on these conversations, you can start looking at where could you optimize your storage to put things into active archives versus weak archives, where you can really control the cost in terms of access control and the like. And then finally, could you optimize your content? The optimization of content ultimately comes down to document compression. So taking those TIFFs and JPEGs and scanned PDFs that are taking up a lot of space, could you make them smaller by converting them and compressing them to PDF? And so we found in our research that a lot of companies are not that aware of document compression technology that's out there. So we have a few examples here. So the first example is a good old TIFF file. It's 141K, and it's an invoice. So if you were to compress this and turn it into a bitonal searchable PDF, how much smaller could it get? Of course, at 141K, you might say, who cares? But it turns out you could actually make it a lot smaller, 76% smaller. But don't just look at the smaller storage amount, right? There's multiple things to look at. One is this on the right side. What's the image quality? We zoomed in on both sides. And so as you look at compression technology, make sure that as you compress the document, that on the other side, you actually have quality. And in addition to that, of course, you're getting a searchable PDF, so there's value in actually being able to access the content more easily. And there is a significant storage savings. Obviously, you need possibly millions and millions of TIFFs before this will actually, that 76% reduction will actually add value. Next example is, again, an invoice, but this time in color. So still a TIFF scanned in color, now a 0.5 megabyte in size. So if you compress this and converted it to a PDF, made it searchable, how much smaller might it get? And the answer is pretty fantastically smaller, 93% reduction in file size, so from 526K to 39K. But again, don't just look at the numbers, but focus on, is the quality good enough? And so we zoomed in before and after. You can definitely tell a difference. The key ingredient is the after image is still fully searchable, no content is lost. Even if maybe the quality isn't quite as sharp, that's not critical. What's critical is do you have access to the content? All right, the next example is a magazine article. Now here, you've got a JPEG file, 7 megabytes in size, so how much smaller might it get? And the answer is much smaller, 99% reduction in file size from 7 megs to 60K, now a searchable PDF. And so again, you can see left side is crisper and sharper, but the text is fully searchable on the right side. and still crisp and perfectly readable. However, if you look at the image, you can see image quality did suffer as part of this file size compression. And so, of course, a question of the use case here. If the content of the article is important, then this is a great use case. If the quality of the picture is the critical aspect, then aggressive compression like this would be a mistake. And so that's part of the things to evaluate as you look at leveraging compression, is to look at the use case, what kind of content is it, and to make the right before and after analysis to make sure that the reduction is in fact going to give you the quality that you need on the other side. The last example is a large drawing, in this case 2 by 4 foot in size. Zoomed in on the left side, 4 megabytes. This is already a PDF, but it's a vector drawing. Vector drawings have a lot more digital content in the first place, so they will not compress as much as raster graphics do, but still 80% reduction from 4.6 megabytes to just under 1 megabyte to turn that into a searchable PDF. Again, you see some degradation in the graphics quality, but the text is fully searchable. So again, from a use case perspective, it's important to look at what are you trying to achieve and making sure that you get the quality and access to the content that you need. So what would a 50% reduction in file size mean? All of the examples that we had were more than 50%, but of course not every document is going to compress as well as this. And of course you're going to have Word and Excel and other files that are not compressible. This is graphics compression here. But back to the examples from earlier in this webinar, if you were paying 120, well, if you could reduce your storage costs, you can see that, of course, this is simple math here, that you could potentially reduce your annual IT cloud storage budget by 50%, therefore generate significant savings. But these are just simple examples. The real reason for me to put this slide up here is for you to encourage you to take a look at what are you paying for each of the different services. The fees will be different. What are the egress fees, especially for AWS, as an example here. In addition to the storage fees that are listed here, there are also access and egress fees to consider here, which will decline dramatically along with the storage fees, because they are, of course, they are also calculated based on how much you download it. So when you download less, you will pay less. So now you might say, oh, well, none of this is relevant. I cannot convert my documents to PDF. I have to keep them in the original file format. And so we've heard this comment a lot, but we've found that it's not necessarily true. So we put a few examples out there. Banking and finance, yes, the regulations say store the original file format, but they also say that a reproduction is perfectly acceptable. And in healthcare, we found the same thing. The original form or legally reproduced form is comfortable. And finally, in the legal space, even went as far as that it needed to be converted to a non-proprietary format that is searchable. So this is really an encouragement to check with your compliance officer if your current rules internal are to keep the original format. You might revisit that and see if that's really true. And then finally, should you keep your documents in the original format, or is it in fact a better idea to convert to PDF, not just from a compression perspective, but is there more to it? And that is where you get into those Office documents. Word as well as PDF, or the Office file formats in general, allow for macros as well as JavaScript. This is exactly how viruses are getting transmitted into organizations. And so you might say, oh, no, of course I have viruses. I have virus protection software. I have JavaScript and macros disabled. And that may be true. But the problem is that every virus that enters an organization, when it comes in, it's a question of, does your virus protection software already know that virus? You know, you'll only catch viruses that are known. not unknown viruses. Now you might say, okay, but I'm protecting it because I'm disabling macros and the like in the Office suite. And that's true too for those users that are fully compliant. But there's always people spinning up systems on their own, especially in the technical side of an organization that are people that are bringing their own laptops in and the like. And so there's always that hole that you need to cover for. And then the second aspect there is that you have is that when you have JavaScript or macros, you may have active content. By active content, we mean documents that were created to stay smart and current. Meaning when you open the document automatically reaches out to get updated interest rates, stock data, the current price of gold or oil, or maybe a currency conversion ratio or something like that, which of course is a disaster from an archiving perspective. You cannot have documents that actively update themselves, and so that's a reason to not allow Office documents inside of an archive. And so finally, of course, when you allow all the original file formats into your archive, well, that means from an IT perspective, you must track all of those file formats to make sure that you always have readers and viewers available to actually open those files 5 or 10 years from now. And that's a cost and tracking effort that may not be attractive to have to maintain. So that's what makes long-term archiving with PDFA as an ISO certified global industry standard is the best place, the best way to archive your content, and therefore avoid all of the problems mentioned here. So from there, if you look at, we're going to go down the road of document compression and conversion. How might you choose the right vendor for this? So the first thing to look at is who owns the compression and conversion technology. And so you want to choose somebody that has this technology and expertise in-house. There's an awful lot of vendors that will say that they can convert and compress, but it turns out they license something from a third-party vendor halfway across the planet. So that means if you make a support call, they'll probably be aware of the fact that they compress things, but they don't know anything about the compression, how it works. And so that means when you have a problem or you need something changed or enhanced, your vendor has no control because they don't own that technology. And so they'd have to go and call their vendor, and that means you're potentially sitting there in limbo for a long time. So, and then of course, make sure that your vendor is actually enterprise ready. You know, if you have millions of TIFFs or JPEGs to convert and compress, are they proven to actually be capable of that? You know, often there are tools that run in a single thread on a single workstation, but they're not able to or capable of crunching through, say, 10 or 100 million documents. And then make sure that they are capable of really working with you on the unique cases that are out there. You know, PDF files that might have embedded Word documents in them is a case that we just had the other day, or PDF files with embedded XFA forms. XFA is already an obsolete standard, but there's millions and millions of documents out there that have embedded XFA forms in them. You still need to be able to handle and get that content. And then, of course, if you're converting millions of documents, make sure that your conversion technology is designed to handle exceptions. There are always exceptions when you have millions of documents, so you've got to have a way to understand which documents have those exceptions and make sure that there's a way to deal with them appropriately. So what else do you look for? One thing is just make sure they're using MRC, the compression. This is the key to achieving the compression results that I showed you earlier. But at the same time, make sure that your content is not getting destroyed as part of the compression. So lossless compression could be a key ingredient to making that happen. Make sure that your vendor's software can scale. So if you have a business that has a certain level of seasonality to it, make sure that it can scale out as well as scale back down. So you're not over budgeting or over scoping or under scoping your projects. And make sure that you don't set yourself up with a single point of failure type of environment so that you don't have to worry about a potential, failure of a piece of hardware or something like that. And finally, avoid proprietary file formats. There are compression vendors out there that produce wonderful compression results in a proprietary file format. Now you're stuck with that vendor, with that vendor's viewer, and no other software that can use that use those files. That's setting yourself up, especially from an archiving perspective, to have big problems down the road in case that vendor for some reason stops to exist or ceases to maintain that file format. So finally, a little bit about Foxit. We're a long time vendor in the compression space and document conversion space for more than 15 years. But everyone in the world has likely used our technology. We're embedded in Google Chrome, Gmail, Amazon Kindle, as well as Microsoft's products for PDF rendering. So everyone on the webinar likely has used Foxit technology just without knowing it. We are doing some research in the space of audio-video compression, in addition to compression of TIFF and JPEG and traditional image documents. So if you're interested in that aspect as well, please contact me. My name is Kai Villa. You can reach me at the contact information on the screen. And that concludes my prepared slides. So if there are any questions, now would be the time to ask them. All right. I have taken everyone off mute, so if you want to ask your question verbally, you can do that. Alternatively, you can ask questions via the chat. All right, here's a question about what is the cost of these technologies and how can the cost be estimated? A cost is typically determined by the number of documents that are being converted, by the number of images in those documents. And so from that perspective, it's not a question that you can, it's a question that you have to answer with it depends. But the best answer is yes, talk to us about it and make sure that you have a clear understanding of what those costs will be. There are also unlimited licenses available if that makes sense for the type of project that you're working on. There are one-time projects prices available, as well as ongoing prices. So if you have sort of a one-time project to convert 100 million or 2 billion images, it's a great way to process through them, but then owe nothing on the other side. I suppose I should have had that in my vendor selection list of things to look for, is make sure you're working with a vendor that's flexible around pricing, so that you can crunch through a large project, but then owe nothing when you're done, and not to have some sort of ongoing maintenance fee that isn't really, that for software that you're not really using any longer, or potentially using at a much lower or smaller denomination. Any other questions? Here comes the question of how do docs get converted? Is this a SaaS version, or is this, does it interact via the web? The answer is this is just software. So you can license this software and install it at your facility. So we do not host this software as a SaaS service, but it's something that's just a traditional software model that's available on-premise, either as a perpetual license or as a subscription or on a consumption basis, on a project basis. Any other questions? Here's another question on what file formats are actually supported. So the focus is on two types of file formats. It's your traditional document imaging formats, which come out of a document scanner. So your TIFF files, your JPEGs, your PNG, those are the types of file formats. Anything that you can imagine coming out of a document scanner can be converted and highly compressed into searchable PDF or PDFA. But then on the file format conversion side, also all the Office document file formats are supported. So Word, Excel, all the open Office formats, email, HTML, zip, of course, PDF are all supported to help with document normalization projects, or also seen projects for where companies had large amounts of documentation in Word, but there was a lot of graphics content in there. So converting to searchable PDF had a big impact from a file size reduction perspective, but also from a perspective of converting to searchable PDF. Any other questions? Looks like there aren't any other questions. So then we thank you for joining the webinar, and we hope to be in contact with you shortly.